Welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I am Marcelo Lewin, Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me, Marcelo, at headlesscreator.com. Now, today's conversation is going to be a really interesting one. We're going to talk about why your company needs a system-independent enterprise content model, and you know I'm into content modeling. My special guest today is Cruce Saunders. He's the founder and principal of A, which you can learn more about at simpleA.com, which is if you're into content modeling or content creation, content strategy, you know Simple A for sure. Now, before we get to the interview, real quick, you know how this works. I'm going to tell you about why you need an account at headlesscreator.com. Well, you know why you need an account at Headless Creator account. You need it because you want access to all of the content, not just this podcast, but you'll have access to pretty much everything in there. The entire Discover Headless Tech course, which includes all of the podcast interviews and tutorials. But then, of course, you're going to have access to pretty much everything else. Content Modeling Weekly. If you're listening to this or watching this, is because you're into content modeling. You're going to have access to the entire course, the retrospective, Beginner's Guide to DHTp, bunch of weekly tips, Headless CMS courses. I mean, a bunch of stuff. Just go check it out. You won't regret it. It's 100% free. So there's nothing to lose there. That's it. So with that said, for those of you watching live, you have a chat in front of you. You can go ahead and ask any questions during the interview when I bring on Cruce. And speaking of, let's bring him on. Cruce, welcome.
Hello, Marcelo, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Glad to have you here. Thank you for being here. I've known about Simple A for a long time, actually, when I first started Headless Creator, when it was actually Contentful Creators, originally way back. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Simple A before we get into the interview, and a little bit about your background as well?
Yeah, so A's been running a decade at this point, and it was started kind of back in the time when we were still looking at create once, publish everywhere content models as kind of a revolutionary way of starting to think about getting content into different channels. And I had run a web development company and an interactive agency. And of course, back in the early days of the web, we had our own content management system, like almost everybody building websites back then. And in all of those, I noticed this major issue that was coming up around the content itself, and the shape and the structure of that content. So a lot of these projects and a lot of these implementations were getting bogged down because we would get to the part where we had to put content in the thing and there was no map or plan. And even when we had one, it was so static and so inflexible and it didn't apply anywhere else. I said, there's got to be a better way. And so we started working on the patterns around content, the invisible side of content. And so that's just been the obsession ever since, is all the structure and semantics around content. I formed A as a way to help organizations build patterns and operations and disciplines around these practices of content strategy, engineering, and operations, all the invisible stuff that makes all the customer experiences and all the channels come alive and work.
So before we jump into content modeling, explain a little bit more about patterns. What do you mean by content patterns?
Well, patterns are all of the things that apply really regardless of your views or your outputs. It's all the stuff that's happening behind the web page or the app. So it's the data structures, right, that are behind the scenes. That's a pattern that can apply in multiple places. There's also really patterns at a market scale as well. Like, for example, there's different standards for getting content to be interoperable between websites, like schema.org, which is it's an established public standard for how to exchange information between Google and the publisher. And that continues to be built and elaborated today. There are millions of websites running schema.org markup, and that is making it possible for content to move and be more portable because there's a shared pattern or an agreement on the structure and the shape of that content, then ecosystems can develop around the content, and it can be used in new and novel ways without having to, do a point-to-point integration. So patterns really enable fluidity, portability, and composability, right? As we're moving toward
Right.
a composable world.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's jump into content modeling itself. And why is it? Well, let's say you have a company that basically says, "Look, we just put out stuff on the web. We don't do mobile. We don't do this and this." Why is still having a content model important for an enterprise?
So content models are going to happen whether you want them to or not, if you've got a digital property of any kind, right? Even if you're running a WordPress site off a template, there's underneath the hood is a
Right.
content model. And so any publisher of any scale is going to work with content models, even if they're not aware that that's what they're doing. So the more aware you get of it, the more you can actually influence what's happening on this other layer of the CMS, and then the layers that happen above that of all of the interactions that we have with content on the public website. So it gives you more flexibility for being in control of the way you publish information, and also more consciousness about how that information gets shaped for the web, and how it moves along its life cycle, or what we call the content supply chain, as it's making its way to the website. So really, it's about becoming conscious of something that's already there and using it to your advantage, and to the advantage of your team and your partners and customers.
Um, so explain how. So we understand that there is a content model behind everything, right? Whether you like it or not, whether you know about it or not. But how does a good content model, that's why I'm saying good content model versus just a content model, right? Help enterprises achieve their goals. Why is it important to do proper content modeling?
Yeah, content modeling at the system level gets you an efficient and well-run website or digital channel. Content modeling at the enterprise level gets you an efficient and well-run, organized, and orchestratable enterprise. So the pieces and parts become composable, and they get done faster and more efficiently than they ever could if you were manually recreating new standards and new structures every time you wanted to create a new experience. And unfortunately today, most organizations are still stuck in the lots and lots of unnecessary cycles and work being exerted by highly paid humans who are really recreating the wheel every time a new customer experience needs to be developed. And it's not really freeing them to do the creative work of getting digital products to market, and whether that's campaigns, or whether that's new channels, or whether that's new interactions with customers and apps. All of those things can be composed out of a well-modeled set of ingredients. But if you don't do the prep work and you don't provide the ingredients, then all your chefs creating customer experiences are going to have to source content, re-prep it, re-systematize how it gets prepped every single time. So it's just like if you were producing, a content kitchen, and you wanted to do that at scale. The more stuff you need to produce, and the more places you need to produce it, the more you need to do it with a little bit of foresight, thought, and some systems around it.
I love that analogy of the kitchen because you need to know where the salt is so you can always go get that, or the pepper, or whatever you're going to add. And we're going to continue with this here. But it's the truth. And to me, that single source of truth, right? Knowing from an enterprise perspective where that blog article resides, regardless of where it's being displayed. So let's take a concrete example and let's take because you mentioned from a strategy perspective that you want to have. So let's take a blog article that is product driven, right? How is that important? How will that help align the overall business strategy for enterprise to create content that helps sell their product, let's say?
Yeah, so any anything that's dealing with product, for example, that's a beautiful one because you're definitely dealing with a shared pattern, right? You're dealing with something that everybody in the enterprise that deals with that product has some common connection to, right? And so the people in support are supporting that product. The people in marketing are marketing that product. But the product itself is a knowledge artifact with a set of attributes around that product. So we believe in content modeling that moves more and more towards true knowledge management, where you are building a knowledge about your product and then expressing it as a blog article, right? But that blog article might include sections like, for example, questions and answers about that product or about features of
Right.
that product. And so you might want to, instead of just having a single blog article on a single page on a single channel, you might want to have that blog article appear on an email newsletter with questions and answers associated with a upselling marketing offer, right? So somebody's doing an offer on a product, somebody's doing support on a product, somebody's doing thought leadership, editorial on the product, and all of those pieces are coming together in different composable ways. The website is one way that might appear, but it might need to also appear on the email channel or the app channel, or it might make sense to reuse that as a syndication on your sister company who it works with that product as well. And so you need to be able to exchange it over there. So Headless gives us an API to do all of those things, which is awesome. But the Headless itself is only as effective as the content model. So paying attention to the content model becomes really not just something you do at the front end of building your initial CMS implementation, but it's an ongoing practice that needs staff, that needs somebody to maintain and manage the model and how it interacts with all of those channels and permutations. So it needs a little bit of content engineering.
Right. And I love the example of FAQs, right? Because that you're usually going to probably have like customer support maintain sort of an FAQ on your product, but then you can share that across other teams. So let's talk about single source of truth, because that's really important. I've been to many websites where I read an article and then I read an opposite article on the same website and they're saying different things of the same feature, right? And it's like, which one is right? And that's because they're probably not implementing single source of truth. So talk a little bit about single source of truth and how is that important in content modeling, specifically for an enterprise?
Mm. We really look at sort of single surface of truth, not necessarily source. There might be multi-source. And so really we're working towards a world in which there's multi-source to multi-destination content interactions. And so multi-source looks a lot like, in any enterprise, I don't know anybody with a single source at all. There's always somebody's got a product information management system or a digital asset management system or a patient, really kind of experience management platform, or they've got a learning management platform. So there's all of these different places where content and customer experiences are needing to interact, and they need to have ways for all of that to work together. And this is the same thing as needing to get, for example, let's say all of the lights in a city to work well together, right? If you didn't have the standards around electricity and the plugs worked differently and the transformers didn't work differently and there was no way to carry the same amount of voltage on a line because there was no standards around the variances, and support for that electrical movement, then the city would be a mess. Nothing would interoperate, right? That's the enterprise with content. We're using the power of our content and our knowledge in order to create and manifest all of these different customer experiences across all these platforms that not going to work in a composable, interoperable way without agreement on the fundamental stuff underneath the hood. So when I say product, when I say question and answer, how do I get that? And how do I call that from that single surface of truth? And really in a truly service-oriented enterprise, I can call that consistently because there's a standard around an API call, and I can know what I'm going to get back from any source because my sources are all sharing the same pattern. And if some organizations, it just makes sense to get all of that into one big, headless system and then use that as the one surface.
Right.
That is totally a good strategy. But in many enterprises where that's not practical, you still need a way to be able to access the content out of those systems in a consistent way. And so get as close as possible to a single query. But if you can't do that, make your queries work the same way across all of your platforms. And the only way that's going to work is if your content model is working in a harmonious, orchestrated way as well.
Yeah, totally. So I'm going to clarify a little bit. When I meant single source of truth, I meant, like, for example, product, the single source of truth for product may be the PIM, right? It's surfaced throughout the organization, but the PIM is where the idea with single source of truth, the way I see it, and I'd love to get your take on it if you see it differently, is that there's one place where that product exists and there's one truth of that product. Now, you can surface it with augmented content from a CMS, with content from a CRM, and there's multiple sources. But my thought from a single source of truth, an organization should try to keep things so that way you don't have product A description here and product A description here, and they're wrong. They're plus updating content. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, well that's classic. There's many different overlapping definitions of any given thing, and that's why we believe in not only unifying the structure but also the semantics within an enterprise. The semantics are all of the things like the tags and the terminology and the way we call things, so that there's also sort of a single source of truth of understanding how to call different things in different places in the enterprise. And so yes, we need to reduce duplication with really just good data practices in general. A big part of data practice on the data side of the world is really reducing risk, to make sure that your data is consistently reliable and it's it's not duplicate and arguing with each other. And so in the data side of the world, that is a really important part of data teams. So I believe we need that in the content world, right?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about more taxonomy, basically standard ways of naming things, right? Which requires some sort of taxonomy that the organization agrees to. So having been in multiple large enterprises and worked on teams, it's very hard to have teams across the organization agree to how we're going to call this.
Right.
One team in marketing may call it one way because that's how they deal with it, and a team in product will call it differently because that's how they work with it, and developers call it differently. So let's talk about some tips that you recommend of how do you break down those, I don't want to call them silo barriers because they can still work together, but still not agree on that taxonomy just because that's how their division calls it or their department. So what's some tips there to agree on all this stuff? Because that's key for me, I believe, is having these standard taxonomies across the enterprise.
Yeah. No, it's a really good issue to note because it's fundamental to the knowledge management lifecycle. It's basically, if we don't know what we're calling stuff and we don't know what our domain is,
how can our customers know?
How can our customers know? How can we create these integrated customer experiences? How can we create content that makes sense on top of all of that? So, I run a podcast called the Towards a Smarter World, and Towards a Smarter World just the last episode, as of this recording, was with somebody who just built a terminology management process inside of her company, and so it it it's a it it took her about a year. It's not easy. There needs to be budget, and in their case, they actually had C-level, um, charter,
Buy-in. Yeah.
because there was some major issues that were happening in the public market, that were based on, in a highly regulated industry, the wrong terminology being used between groups, and it was causing legal issues that were exposing,
Liabilities. Yeah. Right.
millions of dollars worth of liability. So all of a sudden, spending a few $100,000 on getting a terminology system in place became very palatable, because it was against the clear expense of a legal liability. And so they invested in it, put a team around it, and were able to make significant progress in getting people together. And a big part of it was a terminology plan, a model, creating a cohesive conversation, a set of people that are stakeholders in it, and then doing a lot of educating people at the core and getting them embedded then into teams that work with that terminology, and getting them using the terminology management system in a consistent way, and setting up patterns around it, and then publishing about that internally. So it takes work. The same is really true with a content model that is of enterprise scale. And even our client, we've worked with some of the largest enterprise publishers on earth. We've created some of the most complex and also elegant, in my humble opinion, content models that exist. And in that process, there's always an education cycle.
Right.
And the place where our clients fall down in this is not in getting the model developed, it's in getting the model adopted.
Right.
And then in getting the model resourced for maintenance and management, because it's a living, breathing, it's the invisible world of all customer experience, digital experience, and knowledge management. So it needs a team on it. Just like in companies, there's data teams paying attention to data models. Really, in our content and knowledge management, we need content teams. We advocate for building a chartered content services organization, and it's called different things in different organizations, but it's a budgeted organization that pitches and catches the standards for terminology, for the larger world of semantics, as we start to get into other forms of semantics, right? And then like the thesaurus of terms, and like the things that start to look more like a scary word, ontology, right? It's like it starts to look more like a graph over time.
Right.
And the same thing, really on the modeling side, we need somebody who cares not just about the content model for the CMS implementation one time, but someone who cares that the enterprise works well across structure with the CMS implementation, the PIM, the CRM, the interaction with the DAM, all of that, and is able to advocate for that structure and evolve that structure as an enterprise over time.
Well, and I think that's critical, because also as you extend that content model, if you should extend it, or if that piece of information can come from another content model in the organization, right? So this is where you start avoiding this duplication of content models and duplication of data there, because now you have multiple places where you are updating content, right? I mean, I've ran into many problems where if you don't have that one person or that one team managing the content model, the enterprise content model, then everybody goes on their own, and then they start creating content types, which already exist. And now we're having problems with content debt.
Yeah.
Right. Where you have content that is outdated, can't be updated because you updated in one place, but it's really in 20 different other places.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a huge issue. In fact, we're investing a lot of time and effort right now in addressing how that duplication happens in design process, because right now we've noticed that headless implementations, um, they fall down when you're dealing with design teams who create customer experiences in, say, Figma, but then they are implying a content model that doesn't exist, or that exists and gets duplicated multiple times. So this happens in organizations. In fact, we have a client who has dozens of product teams, and each one of the product teams creates separate designs for their products in Figma, totally separately. And when they need to get those shipped, it goes to the CMS team, who builds out a new space and a new model for each one of those things, which might even be duplicated within one product team, let alone across all of them. So the amount of hairball that creates is enough to choke a cat, and we don't want to choke cats. We want living, happy cats. So it's Schrodinger's content model. Like, you need to have a content model that lets knowledge breathe, and part of that is by making sure that it's wired and connected together, not living in these silos of duplication. And so we're looking at we're building tools for like Figma plugins and tools for content models to be able to be shared within an enterprise and visible and managed, so that there are ways to make sure that those things don't get duplicated, because when the designer can see, here's the elements that already exist, and I can pick from those inside of Figma. Or the person building the schema can look inside of the schema source of truth and say, oh, here's the elements that already exist, right? And you can use a headless as that as well, right? You can, if you've got a business process around it, you can use the content model inside a headless as a source of truth. But when you start mapping that into multiple systems, you need some source of truth for the mappings, for the way that all of that works together. The content model in the headless, and the one that's in the DAM, and the one that's in the PIM.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
I've seen that done, obviously, many, many times. And what's even worse is not only are they duplicating the content model, but they're also adding design elements in that content model. And at the end of the day, what you end up with is a legacy CMS on top of a headless CMS.
Oh,
And then when you have to redesign in a year, I mean, the reason we're bringing this up, right, is because enterprises need to understand why you shouldn't be doing this. Because when you redesign, you're going to throw all your content models away. And let's not even talk about limitations of content types on certain headless CMSs that you got to deal with. Otherwise, you pay more. So to me, those are very important reasons why you need the centralized team, or even one person. I mean, in the previous enterprise I worked, I was the person. That was, right? Sometimes you don't need an entire team. Sometimes even one person that can just focus on, okay, where does all this content exist? And when new teams want to add, at least there's that one person going like, hold on a second, I think we can get it from here, right? It's really important. Talk a little bit about design versus content in a content model.
Well, there's a confusion around content modeling that happens even within vendors, I've noticed, where content models sometimes are basically presentation models.
Right.
So the content model in some vendors' mind is how the blocks of text are arranged in a page. So the model is talking about page as the output, really, or the container, the main container for the content types. This creates a page-oriented, output-oriented mindset rather than a true composable, reusable knowledge set. And so, for example, the idea of being able to reuse the right question and the right answer inside of a marketing piece, um, that it really becomes important that it is tagged semantically and containerized at the question and answer level, so that that can be recombined into different scenarios where we're answering questions, right? And as we're moving towards more chat-based interfaces, right, with ChatGPT,
Right.
you know, all enterprise software is going to change, all of it. It's already changed. It's changing at light speed in front of our eyes. HubSpot yesterday
I
released.
watched the video this morning. I know
Yeah,
what you're talking about. I was going to mention that. Go ahead and explain.
yeah.
It was amazing.
It's amazing. They're talking to data, right?
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a need for enterprise publishers who don't want to have ChatGPT guessing the right answer for everything, right? To build answers that are blessed canonically, but then resurfaceable within chat, within interfaces.
But let's explain that a little bit, because I watched it and it's super powerful, but that changes not only the UX experience completely, but it also changes, it makes, to me, in my mind, it makes content modeling, structured data more important than ever now.
Absolutely.
And basically the way it works is in HubSpot, in this example, you want to create a report, you go create report and you select your columns, you select data. There's a bunch of clicks that you go through,
Yep.
right? With what they're about to release, which the CTO actually coded it himself along with the team, I guess, is the effect to deal with a chat like ChatGPT and go, I want a report that gives me the top countries that I'm selling to that are focused in South America, and also add the population to it. That was one of the examples. And he just typed that in, and then it provided that report. And then he said, and now email it to me. And now you'll email it to me every month. But there is no clicking. There is no UX there. It's all conversational,
Yep.
right? That changes the UX experience, but what does that do to a content model?
Well, that's what's going to happen to anybody building any digital property is now going to be put up against the standard of being able to talk to the website. So people want to talk to your website now. That isn't a maybe it's going to happen.
That's happening now.
that's the train has left the station and it's barreling down the tracks, and we are already in a process of conversational interfaces, right? So the conversational interface is there's unstructured ways to do that but it's all going to be based on what? Structured content, right? It's all going to be based on content within your CMS, and you're going to need to be able to bring together conversational experiences that are containerized in ways that the enterprise is able to facilitate, right? And so if you're going to bring something up in an email and in a website, you're going to need a logical container for that to live inside on your actual interface, right? So whether that's just at the CSS level, presentation level, whether that's in the CMS, whether that's across many systems, there's a structure that needs that content needs to live inside, and that structure now takes on more and more importance as we need to get more and more dynamic, because it can't just be one big like insert text here, multiple set of paragraphs, like on a WordPress page, right? Like that only is going to work for static publishers consuming single content in a single place. But for enterprises or for anybody that's interested in dynamic chat-based interaction, they're going to need to get more and more granular with their content. And I believe that these systems like ChatGPT that are large language models will start working with structure, with graphs, with a lot of other kinds of ways of understanding content. So we need to get our enterprises ready to deliver conversational experiences, and content model standards and semantic standards are going to be and are already essential to creating these new kinds of experiences for users.
Yeah. And I think it's more important than ever not to mix design with your content, specifically because of what you mentioned about ChatGPT and these conversational UX experiences, right? where design means absolutely nothing, right? If you have an FAQ and the question is a heading 3 and the answer is a paragraph that's emphasized, let's say, you shouldn't put any of those tags in there, which a lot of the times you are mixing design with content because that means nothing in the conversation anyway.
Mm. Yeah, we work with rich text objects all the time, of course, in models, and so it's at what point do you make rich text acceptable? And at what point do you need to remove all formatting? Um, and I agree with you. I think that the trend needs to be towards, really all annotation post hoc. It's it's challenging to get there. This, I think. This world of authoring experiences continues to move towards something like what you see as semantically marked up content, where there's ability to author long form and bold and do inlines and whatnot, but then extract the text from that, and kind of create an independent, a text independent storage and reuse model, but then allow it to couple with what the authors natively designed in their rich text process, and then also to tag things with semantic meaning so that things can be interrelated.
Exactly.
As
Intent versus design, right?
Yep.
Focus, what is the intent of this? So then you can translate that intent into whatever design you want in whatever channel you want.
Yep.
Yep, definitely. Now, you mentioned many times standards. Talk a little bit more about that. Standards in content modeling. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, really, there's a lot of standards out there for interoperability of content objects. Schema.org is one I mentioned. There's Darwin Information Type Architecture, or DITA, that's out there in the tech docs world, but it's being applied in many other places now too. It's a very specific kind of a content model. There's Dublin Core, which has got sort of metadata standards and whatnot. Are you familiar with all of those?
Fairly, but we can cover some if you like. That'd be
Well,
great.
it's good to know that there are third parties that have put bunches of time and money and resources over time in collaborating on how content moves. The reason that that's useful is you use that as an ingredient in your core content model. A calls it the core content model, which is the enterprise-wide system independent content model that inherits from the headless and inherits from the data structures that are standard in the market, like schema.org and DITA, and inherits from all the different places that need it, and creates essentially a set of mappings that allows content to be coherent when everybody uses that, and works against a rationalized content model. The only way that works is with team assigned to it. And so the reason that these things get stuck is that most teams are only assigned to kind of build the website, right? And so they don't have time to think about the enterprise-wide content model, right? So the people that are watching this are forward-thinking, brave, because they're thinking bigger. But eventually, the enterprise, we've seen more and more C-level content initiatives coming into being, and we've chartered a number of these content service organizations inside of enterprises. So we've seen the money flowing around orchestrating content, getting those to have the right kind of sway and position in an enterprise and funding in order to give them actual ability to help the orchestration process without becoming this, stopping block, centralized everything stopping block, right? That's the balance. We have to be able to empower the creators. That's why we're really interested in Figma plugins. We want to connect creators with structure without giving them shackles, right? Because nobody wants to be like, let me go reference my 50-page manual of content model before I go design it.
Which is, by the way, outdated now because nobody updated it.
Exactly. like that's not realistic, and we get that, and we've lived it. So that's why we're working on ways that we get the content models integrated into tools, integrated into systems, integrated. I believe we need a world where we have schemas that are portable, content models that express as data schemas that actually can be exchanged between systems.
Expand a little bit on that. I mean, like, what are some best practices today that enterprises can start implementing to get to that point? Because what you said is extremely important, I think.
Yeah, it's starting to happen. Most all of the headless providers at this point expose schema via GraphQL APIs, which means that you can get your content model on demand by asking for it. So, tell me what my content structure for article is. Like, you can get a query back and says, here's your schema. Not just here's the articles, right? Not just the content itself, but here's the schema. So where I think we need to go, and all enterprise vendors need to eventually come around to understanding the advantage to them, because there is one, big one, that they need to support the import and export of their content models along a standards-based approach. Because
you're saying the vendors, the CMS vendors.
The CMS vendors.
Let's be honest on there. What's the possibility that that'll happen? Because everybody wants to have their extra edge, right? Competitive edge. So do you really foresee something like that could happen with vendors? Which I agree with. That would be great.
Yeah, I believe that schemas will become portable after the enterprise content service organizations have a large enough stake in true composable environments. And then it starts to become part of the RFPs. And I believe that most vendors who are moving towards composability will eventually understand that their platform grows in market capability and advantage and footprint to the extent that that platform is able to play well with others, is able to pitch and catch content across a whole ecosystem. And that means being able to recognize third-party schemas and represent them inside of their system. And that means being able to say, hey, I got a schema, and having somebody else be able to pull it. Yep. And this is a bigger conversation, but I believe true composability doesn't happen until this ecosystem around schema services comes together.
Yeah, definitely. Cruce, we're getting pretty close to the end here. It's been almost 45 minutes, believe it or not. It's been a really fun conversation. I do have a couple of other questions that I'd like to get in before we go. Yep. Metrics. I mean, you have an organization that's going to put a team or at least a person in there to manage this content model to make sure that it's scalable across the organization. They want to see an ROI on it. What are some metrics that they can use to see that this is successful and prove to the C-level, like, hey, we should continue investing in this?
Yeah. So I think that the great thing about content models is it affects the entire really customer experience itself. And so one of the big things is what are our capabilities before and after we implemented content modeling practices in terms of being able to actually deliver the customer experiences at all, right? So it's a binary shift from could not deliver this to can deliver this customer experience, which creates market opportunity. So there's increased capabilities. The other one is velocity. How fast can we move new customer experiences into being, right? With a headless system, you can do it faster, but not if you're recreating the wheel without by recreating your content model every time. There's a cost, and sometimes it's invisible, or sometimes it's not calculated. Sometimes it's happening because it's part of IT or an analyst role that's kind of buried into cost line items. But if you can quantify, really what is the cost of duplication and rework, and then you can demonstrate all of the efficiency gains as well as the velocity improvements. So it's like any lean ERP or content supply chain. It's about reducing friction across the entire supply chain by making things work well together. And this is very, very intuitive with the two analogies we used already. The electrical system, if you don't have a way for things to interoperate, you really don't have a way for each organization to depend on being able to get electricity from any other place. They have to generate it, transform it, deliver it themselves. There's a lot of extra cost in that. But if they offload that to an orchestrating function within the business, then that's a shared cost that's lower for everybody, and everybody gets to depend on the resulting power that infrastructure provides. So it's really it's a fundamental infrastructure for delivering revenue gains, customer experiences, velocity improvements, capabilities, and ultimately customer value, which translates into share of wallet and revenue. So it's a system-wide set of improvements, and really anybody that is a forward-thinking CEO within a complex environment has to understand system effects in order to be in that role. So we can translate this value beyond the director and VP level, one-for-one level ROI thinking into system-wide and enterprise-wide kinds of return on investment, which is significant in the same category of for example, digital transformation, right? What's the ROI on digital transformation? Well, it's everything everywhere, right?
Right.
It's improvements across the board.
Yeah, definitely. So let's end this conversation with silos, because all of this can't happen if a company is okay with having teams being silos and teams doing what they want to do on their own. What are some tips to break down these silos to have an enterprise-wide thinking? Right? When somebody thinks about adding a feature to the app, they think not just about that feature, but they think about, okay, how does this affect the entire system, the entire enterprise? Where do we get content from? So on and so forth. What are some tips you can offer for that?
Sure. Well, so we work on content orchestration models and helping organizations build these content services organizations, and part of that involves really a lot of dialogue. One of the biggest things you get when you invest in enterprise-wide content models is you get teamwork between silos. We believe in silos. Silos are necessary, and they're not going away, and we're not going to blow them up or anything like that. We're going to connect them and get them working well together in an orchestrated approach. That what that means is listening as well as offering support and enablement and capabilities that help the silos. So if you get in the way of the silos and you make it hard for them, if you get in the way of marketing's ability to deliver customer experiences this quarter, they're not going to want to be your friend, right? because they need to be able to meet their quarterly objectives. But if you can empower them to do that, to get those campaigns done in a faster way, that's more aligned and gives them external resources, right? That's the model we really like to see in content services organizations, is helping to empower all the other teams with additional resources and capabilities that are being offered into them from a unified budget. So it really, the way that they care is they get goodies out of it, and they get to participate in the process in a way that they influence, so that they're influencing the content model. They're not having to just get the content model from on high. They're able to participate in a dialogue from. So how you do this stuff matters, right? Because just putting fiat in and saying we now have We now have one content model that will rule the company, and everybody will resist it. It won't work. It basically just, they'll ignore it, resist it. They'll do their own thing in their own system, their own silo. When you empower it and you make it something that's actually beneficial to everybody to enroll in, and they influence everybody else because of their participation in the model, they're actually motivated to do it. And then if you give them tools, right, that align their designers with the model without getting in their way, and you give them ways of thinking about it with just like internal marketing, then people really can start to work in totally new ways. So it's a unity process, and that's one of the things that I really believe is one of the biggest Gestalt kind of outcomes, the biggest collective or system-wide outcomes of investing in an enterprise content model, is a shared dialogue that happens between stakeholders, not just in silos, but within digital teams across the stack, between designers, developers, content engineers, content strategists, content designers. They're all people who need to share a language. And there's a language of structure and a language of semantics. We can help them by being conscious about that.
Yep, definitely. Great way to end this conversation. It's not about breaking down the silos, it's about orchestrating them. I love that. Definitely a great way to do this. Thank you so much, Cruce. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for being here. I know you guys are going to be back. We're going to do a tutorial on that Figma plugin pretty soon, so people can stay tuned for that. But if people want to get a hold of you, is this the best way if they want to learn more about Simple A?
Sure. Feel free to reach out to me, simpleA.com. We have a YouTube series called The Invisible World of Content you can check out. There's the podcast, which is Towards a Smarter World. And we publish a ton of stuff out there. So take a look at it. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Feel free to, if you're in the industry, come say hi, and I'd love to connect.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Cruce. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Marcelo.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I did. Stay tuned for many more episodes coming soon. So I'll see you on the next podcast episode. Cheers, everybody.